Thank you for joining us. Today we'll be presenting ongoing changes in virtual reference and online learning. The members of Team G are Caterina, Harvey, Paria, and Guinsly. We are a group of library professionals from Canada and the United States. First, we'll walk you through our project background and survey. In January 2022, we were charged to examine gaps in the literature pertaining to virtual reference and online instruction. Create and disseminate a survey to determine trends and changes in virtual reference and online learning. And finally, identify potential areas of professional development related to virtual reference and online learning.
So after the team was introduced to the project during LibLearnX, we brainstormed potential survey questions based on the project's objectives as outlined by Guinsly. Next, we surveyed the literature to understand what librarians were saying about virtual reference and online learning. We quickly learned that this topic has many facets. We completed the survey draft and solicited feedback from our fantastic member guide, Sam Harlow. In March, we finalized and distributed the survey to DOLS and ULS. In April, we analyzed the survey data and developed initial themes. This presentation is the culmination of our research. Next, I'll talk about the literature. So most of the literature related to COVID-19 and virtual reference and online learning could be divided into three themes: impact of COVID-19, changes, trends in virtual reference and online learning, and professional development. Literature related to the impact of COVID discussed changes to online services and the nature of questions patrons asked. For example, library users asked about newly implemented services like curbside pickup. In the next theme, changes, trends in virtual reference and online learning, librarians published case studies of how their libraries transitioned to online reference and one-shot information literacy sessions. As you can imagine, chat usage and the demand for online learning modules increased. Lastly, researchers reflected on best practices for delivering instruction online and how best to align learning outcomes with the ACRL framework. I will now discuss our methodological approach. We took a qualitative approach, created a survey using Google Forms, and disseminated it through DOLS and ULS and ALA's Connect communities. We kept the survey open for 10 days. Once we got our responses, we ran a pilot coding session in which each member coded based on the pilot session results.
So as far as our survey results, we had 14 open-ended and closed-ended questions in the survey. The closed-ended questions were mostly gathering background information from the librarians, but the open-ended questions were about virtual references, online learning, and professional development. We got 51 responses back, and almost 20% were in a directorial or a dean role, and everyone was from an academic library. And we all know because of COVID, everything was shut down, everything moved online, and there were definitely some negative impacts of COVID. One example was that the workload has increased in some libraries because now those libraries have their in-person reference desk, but they also have a chat service that they have to maintain. But there are some positive impacts too. For example, there was mentioned that a librarian wanted to implement chat references, but they couldn't. But because of COVID, they could finally have a virtual reference for their patrons. A lot of the librarians could be embedded into LMS. They also gained a lot of expertise in creating tutorials and teaching online. There inequities that were existing in some of the campuses because of having online students, those were gone because now everything was online. So those inequities were addressed. And of course, some of these, some libraries were purchasing more online resources, and some of these resources were not really user-friendly.
So the issues that Paria highlighted were also reflected in the responses regarding professional development. So the two main areas of interest for professional development were equity, diversity, and inclusion, and accessibility. There were other topics that came up for future professional development programming, and these interests were in relation to embedded librarianship, serving first-year students, serving graduate students, and non-traditional students. While many respondents indicated being engaged in DOLS, ULS, and other sections of ALA, there were respondents who had not attended webinars or trainings offered by these sections. So we think it may be helpful to narrow the scope of the project for next year's cohort and have a project team identify barriers to participation in professional development offerings and see if increasing DEIA-related opportunities would help membership. So in conclusion, COVID has pushed many of our libraries to consider adjusting to needs of students. So as we adjust our services, we also need to adjust our professional development offerings to better prepare librarians for their multifaceted and ever-changing roles and responsibilities. And thank you so much for your attention.